currently sitting in front of my computer, for now, scared out of my mind. Every moment could be my last moment, but I wanted to record this story to let everybody know what's going on. My friend is here with me, and he's the sole reason why my life is in danger. It may not make sense at first, but let me try and explain as best I can. It all started earlier today when a friend of mine burst into my house and slammed the door behind him. His eyes were wide with fear as he stood there with his back against the door, breathing heavily. I asked him what he had done and what happened, so he decided to tell me the story. I wish he had never told me this story. The story began that he had been living with his aunt for the past year because his parents were in Mexico. They were doing mission work at a small hospital in southern Mexico. The previous night, there was a strange man who had stumbled through the entrance of the hospital. He was screaming in Spanish and appeared to be out of his mind with terror. They brought him over to a chair and let him sit down. As he caught his breath, he told the story in broken English. He claimed that his sister had been killed by something he referred to as La Muerto Blanco. He kept saying that it was coming for him next. Confused, they asked him who or what a Muerto Blanco was. With a look of fear on his face, he said that La Muerto Blanco was the White Death. She is the soul of a girl who died years ago. She died by her own hand, he said, alone and unloved. She hated life so much that she wanted to remove all traces of herself from the earth. So great was her desire to completely remove her memory that she returned from the dead as a vengeful spirit bent on killing all those who knew of her existence. She is a girl, but not a girl, he said. She's not dead, but not really alive. She has cold, black eyes that weep blood. She walks without ever actually seeming to move an inch. She stalks her victims like a wild animal, pursuing them across rivers and valleys, trailing them back to their homes. You are never really aware that she is following you until you hear the telltale knock upon your door. She knocks once for your skin, which she'll use to patch her own decaying flesh, twice for your hair, which she'll gnash between her teeth, 3 times for your bones, which she'll fashion into clubs, 4 times for your heart, which she'll tear out of your chest, 5 times for your teeth, which she'll polish and keep in a box, 6 times for your eyes, which she'll pluck one by one, 7 times for your soul, which she'll swallow whole. No matter where you go, the White Death will track you down, and you will hear her terrible knocking begin on the door. You can try and outrun her, but she's faster than any mortal man. If you flee from your home while she's knocking on your door, she will follow you wherever you will go. The terrified man was certain that this thing had killed his sister. He had tried to tell the police about the White Death, but they would not listen, dismissing it as an old wives' tale. Next, he had tried to tell his priest, but the priest immediately shut the door of the church in his face and turned him away. The priest had seen the White Death following him, he said, and did not want to get involved. With his head in his hands, the frightened man said that the White Death follows you forever until you tell someone else about it. Then it strikes. It kills you and begins following the person you told. After finishing his tale, the man stole a car from the Mission Hospital parking lot and vanished into the night. Apparently, my friend's mother and father had immediately called his aunt and told her about the strange man they had encountered, to find out if she had any chance heard of this story of the White Death. She said no, and she's never heard about it, so they proceeded to tell her the story that the man had told them. The aunt had gotten a phone call later that night. It was the Mexican police. They told her that the parents had been found dead outside the hospital. They'd been torn apart. My friend's aunt had immediately called him at school to break the bad news to him. As he cried, she told him she couldn't understand what had happened. She recounted the whole story to him, telling him about the strange man who turned up at the hospital just hours before his parents were found dead. She told him how the man had given his parents a weird and disturbing story about something called the White Death. When he hung up the phone, he had struggled to come to terms with what had happened. It almost didn't seem real to him. So when he got home after school, he found the front door of his aunt's house standing open. Inside was a trail of blood leading into the kitchen. There on the kitchen floor, he found his aunt's dead body. She'd been torn limb from limb. He ran out of the house and all the way across town, never looking back until he reached my house. As he told me this story, I could hardly believe it. Within the space of a day, his mother, his father, and his aunt had all been murdered, and it seemed all too far-fetched. But before I could utter a word, my friend and I both recoiled in horror as we heard a knocking begin at my front door. We've been staring at the door for an hour now, neither of us wanting to open it. The knocking is still going on, growing louder and louder. She never gives up. She never quits. La Muerto Blanco is unstoppable. I think she wants to scare us, my friend and I. I think she wants us to blame each other, and I do. I blame my friend. It's all his fault. He should never have told about her. So as I sit here in my house, beside my friend, in front of my computer, telling this story, we're still sitting here listening to that hideous knocking growing even louder. I wish a lot of things. I wish he had killed my friend before he reached my house. If he had never been able to tell me about her, I wouldn't be in danger now. I'm sorry that I even met him. I wish that he was dead. Sounds terrible, but this wouldn't be happening if he was. And now, I'm sorry for you too. I'm sorry that you listened to this story. I'm sorry that I ever told you about the White Death, because now that you know about her, she'll be coming for you next. So be prepared to hear a lot of knocking. A 15-year-old girl named Donna had lived with her father in a small house in the suburbs. Ever since her mother died, Donna had depended on her father for everything. They had a wonderful relationship and loved each other very much. One morning, Donna's father was leaving on a business trip. As they ate breakfast together, he told her that he would be home very late that night. With that, he kissed her on the forehead, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out the front door. Later that day, when Donna came home from school, she did some homework and watched some TV. By midnight, her father still had not returned, so she decided to go to bed. That night, she had a crazy dream. She found herself standing at the edge of a busy highway. Cars and trucks whizzed by at an alarming rate. She looked across the highway and saw a familiar figure standing on the other side. It was her father. His hands were cupped around his mouth and he seemed to be shouting something to her, but she couldn't make out what he was saying. As the traffic whizzed by, she strained to hear. Her father's eyes were sad. He seemed to be desperately trying to communicate something to her. She could barely make out the words. Don't open door. Suddenly, Donna was awoken from the dream by a strange tapping noise. Tap, tap, tap. Then someone began to ring the doorbell downstairs. Ring, ring, ring. She scrambled out of bed and put on her slippers. Then, dressed only in her nightgown, she ran downstairs and went to the front door. Looking through the peephole, she saw her father's face outside. He was staring right at her, but the doorbell kept ringing incessantly. "Okay, hold on, I'm coming," she shouted. She pulled back the deadbolt and was about to unlatch the door when she stopped. She looked through the peephole at her father again. Something about his expression didn't look quite right. His eyes were wide open, and he looked terrified. She slid the deadbolt back in place. "Dad," she yelled through the door, "did you forget your keys?" Ring, ring, ring. Dad, answer me. Ring, ring, ring. Dad, please, I need you to answer me. Ring, ring, ring. Is there someone else out there with you? Ring, ring, ring. Why won't you answer me? Ring, ring, ring. I'm not opening the door until you say something. The doorbell kept ringing and ringing, but for some reason her father refused to answer her desperate cries. For the rest of the night, the frightened girl cowered in the corner of the hallway, helplessly listening to the ceaseless ringing of the doorbell. It seemed to go on for hours and hours. Eventually, she fell into an uneasy sleep. At dawn, she woke up and realized that everything was quiet. She crept over to the door and looked through the peephole again. Her father was still there, staring at her. She cautiously opened the door and was confronted with a sight that filled her with unimaginable horror. Her father's severed head was hanging from a nail above the door. There was a note attached to the doorbell. In a crude, scrawled handwriting, it read, "Clever girl." Rowan liked to go to the cemetery to think. It was a quiet place, a peaceful place. The dead did not disturb, did not talk back or yell at you. Not that her parents ever yelled at her, but they yelled at each other, and that was enough. She went to the cemetery a lot to get away from them and from the world in general. Tonight was no different. The cemetery was closed at night, but that didn't stop Rowan. She had found wire cutters in her father's toolkit in the old musty garage. The toolkit had been stuffed carelessly in a corner of the garage, unused for years, but the wire cutters were still sharp, though tarnished. Rowan had cut one long line in the chain-link fencing far from the huge stone arches that led into the cemetery. Just enough for her to pull back and push herself through. She felt guiltier about cutting the fence than she did about entering the cemetery at night. After all, this was her home away from home. But cutting the fence was vandalism. Tonight the moon was full and beautiful. It shone a very bright light on the tall old tombstones that surrounded her. They were so majestic in their own morbid way, standing up to announce to anyone they cared to see that someone that had once been alive and on the earth was now there in the ground, or perhaps far, far away in some other life, or in heaven. Rowan didn't know. She thought on it often. She was so interested in looking up at the moon that she walked right into them. "Ah, look, it's a little girlie," cried one of the boys. "Well, isn't that just special?" another said. The one she had ran into grabbed her by the waist, much to Rowan's surprise and horror. She was completely caught off guard. She hadn't seen them there in the shadow of the large pine trees. There were 3 of them. By the look, they were high school students, older than she was by a few years. She saw one holding a beer can. Rowan's first instinct was anger. What were they doing in her cemetery? She pushed her hands against the boy's chest, trying to get away from him. She nearly succeeded. Unfortunately, he had a tight grip on her. That's when her anger turned to fear. "Let me go," she nearly screamed. "Oh, no screaming, girlie. Just be quiet and no one gets hurt. Mainly you," the boy laughed. He looked her up and down. "Well, not really my type, but she'll do." "Yeah," another boy agreed. Rowan squirmed to no avail. She knew she was in very serious trouble. She wished her father would show up. She wished her father knew where she was. Or anyone. Just then, a deep, throaty snarl began from the shadow of the trees. A huge timber wolf stepped from the darkness into the moonlight. His thick gray and black fur shone in the moonlight, as did his rather large, menacing fangs. "Oh shit! Oh shit!" The boy holding Rowan let go of her and backed away quickly. He backed over a rock and fell to the ground, scrambled backwards on his ass and managed to get back up. He looked at his friends and yelled, "Run!" They did. Rowan stood her ground.
She wasn't afraid, though she couldn't say why. There was this strange shimmer. Rowan couldn't describe it exactly. It was as if the air changed, as if colors merged and swirled and the wolf became particles, then reformed into a human boy with longish, thick black hair. Still, Rowan stood her ground. She waited, shocked but not entirely surprised. After all, had she not just been saved by a timber wolf from certain rape by a pack of high school boys? "Hello," the boy said. "Hi," Rowan managed. She was started to think that she was at home dreaming all this. You're not dreaming," the boy wolf said, as if reading her mind. "I've seen you here before. Often. I'm Alaric. What's your name?" "Rowan," she paused. What are you?" She felt immediately rude for asking and blushed. "Well, I'm a shapeshifter," Alaric smiled. "And you aren't afraid to show people that?" Rowan asked. She was sure she was dreaming now. "I'd never really show anyone, but as I said, I've seen you here before, watched you, and can tell you were, how should I put it, cool?" He smiled again. "You aren't really dreaming, but you should probably get home. It's late. I'll be here tomorrow night if you want to come see me and we can talk more about it." She just nodded and walked away, looking over her shoulder several times to see if he was still there. He was. Rowan watched Alaric walk through the cemetery before her, leading her to where he claimed to spend most of his time. He walked with a certain natural grace. He was talking about the cemetery, telling her things, she was sure, but she was having trouble focusing on that. Right now she was remembering how he had said he had seen her often, and Rowan was wondering if she should find the fact that he had been watching her creepy or charming. "Here we are," he suddenly announced at a point where they stood near nothing in particular. "Where?" asked Rowan, finally deciding to choose charming. He was a handsome boy, which had not escaped her notice. His eyes were a stunning green color that went well with his black hair, and his face had a chiseled appearance that made him look both tough and rather regal at the same time. Alaric pointed at the mausoleum in front of them. It was a one-story house filled with stained glass windows and a big, solid door that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. The cemetery dated back to the 1800s. "There?" Rowan gaped. "Yes, there." Alaric stepped up and swung the door open. "Come on in. It's safe. There's plenty of light in here, and we can talk." You live here or something? Where's your home? Don't you have a family?" "Well, my family is dead," Alaric said shortly and stepped inside. Rowan followed. She expected a musty old tomb, but what she found surprised her. Other than the two deceased occupants who lay in their coffins against the two side walls, the room was clean. The floor was stone, as were the walls, and it had been swept clean. Even the windows, beautiful red and blue stained glass, looked clean. There wasn't a cobweb in sight. In a far corner lay a bed made of grass with an old blanket carefully laid over it. "You sleep here?" Rowan asked. "I live here." "Oh." She had always thought of it as her cemetery, but she felt no jealousy now, only wonder that a boy can live in a cemetery all alone. "I'm sorry, I have no chairs to sit in." Alaric jumped up and sat on one of the coffins. "Oh," Rowan repeated. She was at a loss for words. It was enough that when she had returned to the cemetery tonight, he had been waiting. It hadn't been a dream after all. She struggled slightly, but was able to get on the other coffin. She felt a twinge of guilt for sitting on someone's final resting place. "Ask me anything," Alaric said. He seemed ecstatic to have company. "Well, how long have you been alone? I mean, we are alone, aren't we?" She looked around. "Yes, too long." He paused. "Years." Rowan gaped. She couldn't imagine being so alone so long or living in a mausoleum. On the other hand, it sounded so thrilling, but on one other so lonely. Well, how old are you? She asked. He frowned. What age are you, Rowan? 14. Me too, he answered too quickly. He saw the look of suspicion on her face. I don't really remember, he admitted. It's hard when you don't celebrate birthdays with anyone. Rowan thought about that. No one to give you presents or a cake. Even her parents took time out of their fighting to celebrate her birthday. So, she paused. May as well just jump in. You can change shape? Alaric smiled. Yes, I can, to any living thing. Well, how long have you been able to do that? Well, since forever, I guess. Alaric explained how his father had taught him how at a very young age, and how his father had taught him before that. It's passed down generation to generation, he said. Is it like being a werewolf? I don't know any werewolves, Alaric laughed. But when a shapeshifter dies, they always go back to their true form. So I guess in that way, they are all like werewolves. Rowan asked Alaric if it hurt to change. He told her it had at first, when he was young and learning, but now it didn't. It was natural to him. Can you show me something? One of your favorite forms? Rowan asked. The air began to shimmer and change around Alaric. The color of his hair and clothes began to run together and turn to particles, and she could no longer see him clearly. They spun in the air in a beautiful rainbow pattern. Then suddenly he was gone, and in his place stood a very large coal-black raven. Rowan gasped. The raven spread its mighty wings and flew over to her coffin. It stood by her side and looked at her with Alaric's bright green eyes. Incredible, beautiful, Rowan whispered. Again the air shimmered. This time she could feel it because Alaric was so close to her. She felt the energy against her arms and face, not unlike static electricity, but much stronger. The colors blurred once more, and then Alaric sat beside her. He was grinning. Can you teach me how? Rowan asked excitedly. Unfortunately, no. You have to be born with it, or have a shapeshifter die near you, and you can have their essence go into you. Oh, wow, Rowan smiled. Rowan started sneaking out of her bedroom window every night to go see Alaric. She wasn't worried about being caught. Her parents rarely paid any attention to her. Sometimes they would sit in the mausoleum and talk. Sometimes they would walk the cemetery. She told them everything about her life, how her parents were constantly fighting, and how they ignored her. How she only had one friend at school who would never come over because of her parents, and whose house she only rarely visited. She just didn't fit in, though she was an excellent student, but only because she was curious by nature and threw herself into her work. Alaric told her about his life as well, but very little. Mostly he listened. Their friendship grew, and while Rowan would never admit to it, she was falling in love. He was serious when he needed to be, but was quick to smile or laugh. They laughed a lot. It was an overcast night that Rowan showed up at the cemetery crying. Storm clouds threatened the sky. Rain wasn't far away. She ran to the mausoleum and didn't even see the raven that swooped after her. Rowan started calling Alaric's name desperately. I'm here, he said, far behind her. Rowan threw herself into his arms, sobbing. Alaric wrapped his arms around Rowan and held her even as the rain began to pour down on them. They stood right outside the mausoleum doors, neither willing to break the embrace to step 2 feet into the dry interior. Thunder crashed, and Rowan tremored. Alaric spoke softly. Come inside, Rowan. He broke the long embrace and took her hand to lead her inside. My parents are getting a divorce, she blurted out when they got inside. They talked for hours. He held her for most of it while she cried. Alaric didn't say much, perhaps not knowing what to say. Still, he was there, and slowly she calmed down. "I should see you home," he said. "You'll walk me?" Rowan sniffled. "Yes, the storm is over." They walked in silence. Alaric had never walked her home before. They held hands, and Rowan felt happy despite everything. They started to pass a gas station with a mini-mart in it, and Rowan stopped. "Let's get something to drink." Alaric laughed. "Like our first date, except I have no money to buy the lady anything." "Well then, I'll buy the gentleman something." Rowan grinned. She felt joy she had never felt before. Alaric opened up the door, and Rowan stepped inside. She was still looking back at Alaric, grinning, or she would have seen the deadly danger ahead of her. Alaric did see it, and he knew immediately what was going to happen. The gunman holding up the cashier did not expect customers at 3 a.m. on a rainy night, turned in shock when the doorbell rang, announcing someone coming in. He was high on meth and alcohol, and extremely paranoid and jumpy. He turned his snub-nosed .38 towards the door and pulled the trigger without even thinking. Alaric saw all this happening in slow motion, and he knew that surely Rowan would die if he didn't act, and act fast. He had speed on his side, being a shapeshifter. He changed slightly and shoved her aside hard. Rowan crashed into a popsicle case, screaming in surprise and pain. The bullet tore through the air where her head had been and slammed into Alaric's chest. He was thrown back against the glass doors. Rowan heard the roar of the gun but didn't understand. Why Alaric pushed her, what was that noise, and what the hell was happening? She lay on the floor, her hip hurting badly from hitting the case. She turned towards the door in time to see a ragged-looking man running out of them, holding what looked like a gun. Alaric was on the floor, blood blooming out onto his white shirt. He was struggling to get up. Rowan screamed again. What had happened hit her and hit her hard. She could hear the cashier calling 911, but it didn't matter. Alaric was bleeding. Alaric was shot. "We have to get out of here now," he said, blood flying off his lips as he spoke. Rowan stopped thinking and grabbed his arm to help him up. They staggered out of the gas station and moved quickly away. Rowan did not know where they were going. It seemed they moved forever, him coughing up blood and her trying to help him run. Before she knew it, they were at the edge of the cemetery, at the gate where they had come out. "Help me get back in," he asked weakly. She did as he asked. Once inside, he lay down under a huge pine tree. He stared up at the night sky. She sat by his side, taking his hand in hers. "Shouldn't we get you to the hospital?" she asked desperately. "I'm dying, Rowan. I can't go to a hospital." "No, you can't die." "I'm strong. Most would have been dead by now, but I'm not strong enough. I'm just glad I made it back here to my home, and I'm glad you're here with me." Rowan started crying, tears coursing down her cheeks. "I've always watched you, you know, since you first came here. I've always wanted to talk to you," Alaric said. "I'm glad I finally did." Rowan cried harder. "Isn't there anything you can do? Change into something else that can live? A bear? A tree?" "No, it's too late. Listen." She quieted down. "Energy never dies, Rowan. When I leave this form and change into my true form, my energy will leave that body and go. If you are here with me, it'll go into you. You will become what I am. If you want to, that is." Your true form? I don't understand." "I've always loved you, and I always will." He coughed up more blood and was silent. He looked into her eyes one last time, then closed his eyes and began to shimmer. She felt his energy all around her, and she welcomed it in. It felt warm and loving and like home. On the ground lay the body of a raven. If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. If you'd like to, you can follow me at Twitter. The handle is @FuzzyPantaloons, and I'll see you all next time.